So today we're going to be talking about socialization, and I know I feel like I say this about every chapter. Culture was crucially important, and helps you understand, a whole bunch of things. Socialization helps you understand yourself, I think, more than, in a way, even than culture, because this is all about how you became you, or how you develop the concept of who you are, what your capabilities are, how you operate in the world. Um, so I guess you can understand then in this opening section of socialization, its purpose and its importance. It is just crucially important. It's the lifelong process through which people learn culture and become functioning members of society. So the purpose of it, there's four key functions of socialization. The first is that it teaches us role taking. You are very aware of this, I'm sure. Well, some of you may be more aware of it than others because we do it. We do it without thinking about it. Really, we act out different roles. We take different roles in different situations with different you're very different with your friends, I'm sure, than you are in a classroom or on the job or in a church. If you go to church, whatever the situation is, we all have different kind of personas or beings that we utilize in different situations. So that's the first one. It teaches us role taking. We act differently in different situations with different people. We learn the appropriate situational rules and behavior through socialization. I mentioned church, and I might have said this in one other lecture. When I was very young, the clothing you wore to church was very different than the clothing you wore, Sunday best, than you wore every other day. Um, so that's situational. How do we learn that? How do we know that? How do we know what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate in different situations? We learn it through our socialization. The second purpose of socialization is that it establishes our social identity. So that's our sense of self. Even though we're playing many roles, we're still ourself within those roles. The persona we kind of put on are the appropriate behaviors, but we don't completely change our identity in those different situations. The third purpose of socialization, this is a huge one, is that it controls behaviors. So remember about norms in the last chapter. This is relative to that in a sense. It controls our behavior because we learn what's appropriate in different roles. We absorb the values and rules. Norms are rules about appropriate interaction and behavior. If we follow the rules, we're rewarded. We learned this in the last chapter. And if we break the rules, we're punished in, to greater or lesser degrees, depending on what rules we're breaking. Um, and the reason that we conform, or that most of us conform, is because of what's called internalization. We have internalized all those rules that we have learned um, through our socialization. So the cultural behaviors and the expectations, we accept them without question once we're fully socialized. We don't even think about it. And then another key aspect of socialization, it's the way that culture gets transmitted from generation to generation. Our parents, or whoever we're with when we're very, very, very young, born to, the very first few years of life, are our primary and most important and long-lasting socializers. So those transmission from generation to generation of language, beliefs, the norms, the values, the symbols, that type of thing. That's another purpose of socialization. So the question of why it's important, I think, is kind of self-evident. It's everything. It underlies everything that we do, that we think, that we feel, that we believe about ourselves and others, etc. So it's important because one of the things we know is that without socialization, We really aren't fully human. And language, remember we talked about last time, without language, there can be no culture. Well, how do we learn language? We learn it through our socialization. So, Jeannie is discussed in your textbook. I put up a link to a much more detailed understanding of Jeannie and who she is and what her experience was. And also, there's photos of Jeannie in that if you want to see what she looks like. So, Jeannie was locked up at 20 months old. Her awful father just decided that she was retarded. And so locked her up, put her in a cage. She was never spoken to. She was like a wild animal, basically. And this is often the feral children that we hear about that have been found, raised by wolves or whatever. It's kind of the same, although Jeannie wasn't even raised by wolves. If you were raised by wolves, you'd be raised in a pack and you would, have the socialization of a wolf. Jeannie had none at all. And she was discovered and found in 1970 when she was 13 years old. She had never spoken. She had no way to learn language. She was completely unsocialized, and as the people who found her said, she was hardly human. That was their terminology. So she wound up in a rehabilitation ward. Lots of therapists and doctors and people worked with her, of course, and eventually in a foster home for a while. I believe she had to be removed from the foster home eventually and was reinstitutionalized in a good situation because she just wasn't socialized enough to live in a foster home for a long period of time. But she did eventually learn to eat normally. She finally was toilet trained. Now remember, she wasn't found till she was 13, and it took a while to get her toilet trained. She gradually developed some language, but she never got beyond the ability of about a 3-year-old in terms of language and vocabulary. She never learned appropriate behavior about if something belongs to somebody else, you can't just grab it and take it. Was very explosive in her temper, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been other, unfortunately, research on isolated children that have been found. And there was a huge orphans study done in the 30s that was quite interesting. Children in orphanages. What the research on isolated children has shown is that socialization is just absolutely critical to development, to not just social development, but even brain development, as we'll see later as we move through the chapter. So we learned to do the kinds of things that Jeannie had to be taught after the age of 13, we learned to do from starting in infancy. We're socialized in infancy, beginning with all those things. And so then there's also the Harlow monkey studies. There's a photo in your book, and I put up the larger photo in the class. Uh, that was a very sad study. What they did was they took little baby monkeys, and uh, they took them away from their moms, and they had two fake monkeys. You can see the picture there. That they could nurse from. They had a bottle. They were kind of built as a wire cage sculpture. The mommy monkeys, and one of the mommy monkeys was just the wire structure to make a sort of a body with a bottle of formula coming out of her chest. And she had a very scary face, if you could see in the photos. She had a long snout and not a nice face at all. The other monkey mom, fake monkey mom, was the same structure, wire structure, but they put toweling over her, so she was more soft and cuddly. And she had a round face and round eyes, kind of like a smiley face. But she didn't have a bottle to nurse from. And the baby monkeys wound up spending much more time with the nice mommy, the warm, fuzzy mommy with the smiling face and the toweling that was soft around the wire cage. And they would just run over to the cold wire monkey mother with a mean face and nurse a little bit and then rush back. Some of them didn't even nurse enough to really get enough nutrition. They just didn't want to be with a cold wire monkey. So that was another example of how important nurturing is, and something that feels friendly and approachable to infants rather than hostility. So now we're at the nature versus nurture debate. This is an ongoing debate since the dawn of the scientific age. How much of who we are and what we are is nature, kind of hardwired, whether that's genetic or just human DNA, aside from our individual genetics, and how much is created by society, by the nurture aspect of it. And so there's for people on the nature side, there's a couple of kinds of evidence that they use. And the first one that they talk about is the developmental differences between males and females, which are quite striking. And the second one that they use is unsuccessful sex reassignment cases. And there's the study of David Brenda also in your text there, we'll talk about briefly because it's in a box and it's in quite detail. So, what are the developmental and health differences between male and female that lead the people on the nature side of the debate to believe that primarily what we are is based on nature and not nurture? First of all, boys develop more slowly than girls do. They get sick more often. They're less likely to have mastered self control and fine motor skills necessary for successful starts in school. Boys are at a greater risk than girls for most of the major learning and developmental disorders. They're as much as 4 times likely to suffer from autism, attention deficit disorder, or dyslexia. Girls, however, are twice as likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, eating, and disorders. And eating disorders, excuse me, depression, anxiety, and eating disorders. Uh, when they are adults, women, the sense of smell and taste is much more acute in women. Hearing is better; it lasts longer. But women have a higher risk of developing diabetes than men. So there's all these hardwired, that would be nature, right? Appear to be hardwired, let me put it that way, differences between males and females. And then the second, so that's the first example is the differences between men and women. And then the second is unsuccessful sex reassignment cases. So you can see once again, the David Brenda research in 1972, the box on page 64. What happened with him was when he was an infant, he was circumcised, and there was it was a botched operation. They cauterized, instead of cauterizing just the foreskin, they cauterized his whole penis. So his penis was gone from the time he was an infant. The doctors, came to the parents and told them what had happened and said, it's virtually going to be impossible. Now, remember, this was a much longer ago than current day. It's going to be virtually impossible to uh, do anything about creating a penis, and he can never have children anyway. He would never be fertile, et cetera, et cetera. So you could kind of leave him like he is, which is kind of a freak in modern society, or in those days, once again, or we can turn him into a girl. The parents chose the latter. So he went through, you can read it. I don't want to spend hours on this. It's already going to take 2 videos, I think, to get through this chapter. But they did everything they needed to do, hormone therapy, a variety of other things, surgery to turn David into a girl. Well, David was miserable, it turns out, being a girl. His mother was in denial. She said things like, oh, he loves to dress up and play what he was acting out in school, in grammar school. People were making fun of him. Nobody knew about David, didn't know what had happened to him. From the time David knew consciously he was a female, but he was a biological male, had been born a biological male. Uh, so he became suicidal in adolescence, and his father finally told him the truth about himself. He had a sex change operation reverse. He wound up getting stopped taking hormones, female hormones, and all of that. He wound up getting married when he was an adult to a woman who had a couple of children. And when he was in his 30s, he committed suicide. You can read all of that, as I said, in the box. You could also research him. The name is in the chapter there, David Riemann. He was known as Brenda as in childhood. That's why it's the David Brenda thing. Very, very, very sad story. So that's another example that is used by the nature people on the nature side of the nature versus nurture debate, that they see, sex is it's completely hardwired, and there's nothing you can really do about that. So uh, those are the two arguments: differences between males and females in unsuccessful sex change operations, sex reassignments. Now, what about nurture? Okay, most sociologists are going to tell you that nurture is the key factor in determining how we turn out, who we are, what we are. Okay, they point out successful sex change, sex reassignment operations, and as we know, there are increasingly more and more of those as gender becomes more fluid as the years move on. So there's also they point out two types of data uh, regarding variations in male violence and the environment's effect on biology. So we'll go through these a little bit here. So what are the cross-cultural variations in male violence? Well, to put it, the bottom line is all males in all societies across the world, there is not necessarily male violence. We do not see males manifesting the same kind of behaviors that we see in other societies, which tend to be more violent. So, if testosterone created innately violent male behavior, then it would be the same across, equally violent across all cultures. That's not so. So the proportion of women suffering from male physical violence from male partners varies greatly. East Asia, it's about 16% of women. North America, 21%. 41% in Western Latin American countries, and 66% in sub-Saharan countries. Can you see how there must be culture involved there? Because once again, if it was just testosterone, it would be steady throughout all cultures, and it is simply not. So they point out that all mass murderers have been men, but then most have occurred in the U.S. So you got to look at. Jack the Ripper famously was in England, which is American culture derives from England. It's kind of interesting. So if that's true, that the vast majority of mass murderers have existed in America, it must have something to do with the culture. Otherwise, they would be evenly distributed throughout all cultures. So the variations that we just described really are talking about, they reflect cultural practices, laws, and other environmental factors. The environment means nurture. It doesn't mean the environment, like we talk about environmental destruction and things. It is not talking about nature, the natural environment. It's talking about the environment in a person's milieu, in their family, in their homes, in their school, in their social class, a variety of other things. And so I wanted to point out to you, if you're interested in this subject, Margaret Mead, great anthropologist in the 1930s, did research on this very subject. The book is called Sex and Temperament in Three Cultures. And those three cultures were in one little country, Papua New Guinea, and she was working with indigenous people. And it's in our library and readily available. It's an amazing book. And what she found were three different societies she studied. One where the men were kind of violent, one where the women behaved much more like the men, and one where and nobody was nice to children. The kids were kind of on their own and barely survived. And then one where the males were the nurturers of the children. So once again, this from a social science perspective, this refutes the nature argument to the in saying that it definitely all this behavior is hardwired. So how does environment affect biology? Because some of these things are somewhat biological. So the research shows the effects of the environment and nurture and its influences on children's genetic makeup, nature. So you start, yeah, we all have genetics. Can you influence that one way or another by environment? You can. You can. Diabetes and obesity are examples that they actually bring up. Those are can be genetic, uh, but how you are fed can very greatly affect how the outcome of those uh, genetic influences and how you eat. So birth defects are associated with prenatal exposure, both the mother and father in the first 2 to 3 weeks of pregnancy. Drugs and alcohol, man, that could completely mess up uh, a fetus's brain and other organs and functions. What's interesting is that most people think of that as maternal alcoholism or drug use, but it turns out that, as they point out in the text, that also paternal alcohol excess alcohol usage, it affects the sperm, and there can be defective sperm that then affect the outcome for the fetus. So there's this growing field of what's called fetal origins, scientific field, medical field, which is, I think, quite interesting. Um, so the reason there's this intense study on it is that the text points out those 9 months of when we're in the womb are by far the most consequential period of our lives. And the things that our parents ingest or have ingested in the past to excess often permanently affects the wiring of the brain, organs like the heart, liver, and behavior. So nutrition is huge here. It's not just drugs and alcohol. It can also be trauma in terms of psychological trauma or stress of the mother. Um, so the parents' healthy eating habits, the mother's stress levels have lasting effect uh, from infancy through our lives. And then adult behavior can influence in other ways too. So for children, physical or sexual abuse can inhibit the biological development of the child, or it can cause behavioral and psychological problems, which we're much more familiar with sexual abuse or psychological abuse. And it's interesting, a lot of research is done with siblings because although siblings share an awful lot of genetic material, things like birth order make a huge difference. The family economic situation when one child is born and when a later child is born, maybe there's more money or less money in a difference between children in a family and their birth order, the kinds of schools they attend, the siblings. Maybe you've moved and one sibling got to go to a great school, and then you move and it's not such a great school district, and so the upcoming sibling, the younger sibling, is going to a crummy school, not getting what they need or the intellectual stimulation that they need. So it can affect also interests, social skills, all those academic outcomes we talked about, the birth order, and what the experience of the family. That's the environment. That's not genetics. What's going on with the family, economically, the neighborhood. Are you living near or far away from grandparents? Maybe one child, when the first child was born, they were very close to grandparents and they got that extra nurturing and stimulation grandparents do so much. And then the family moved away and was more isolated and didn't have that resource. So you get the point. Okay, so what are the conclusions about the nature versus nurture debate? So in twin studies, For instance, there's more than 300, they researched more than 300 characteristics. So on average, they decided that about 49%, this is twins, remember, about 49% had to do with genetics and 51% with environmental issues, with nature versus nurture. But some traits are more likely to be inherited than others, things like a cleft lip, for example. Those twin studies are often done on twins that were separated. That becomes very interesting to see how one grows up and how the other grows up and what their values and beliefs are, what their physical, medical, genetic conditions are. So the social environment can either uh, it can enhance what's there genetically already, or it can dampen it and hurt it. So not all children who are predisposed to do obesity, for instance, become overweight. Most do. But what it requires, as your textbook points out, is environmental intervention. So parents have to really be on what their kids eat, that they get plenty of exercise, that they're not doing 8 to 9 hours of social media a day that we'll see later in this chapter. Young people are doing today. You can't sit around on your butt. So that's environmental intervention. Yes, there's a predisposition to obesity, but that can be offset. You can also, one of the things that they've looked at a lot is IQ and achievement, particularly by adoption. Kids that are placed with upper middle class parents and middle class, they tend to grow up to be wealthy, and vice versa happens. Okay, with kids that are placed with lower income families, they tend to not grow up to be wealthy. Well, that yes, inheritance has something to do with it, but the studies, what they're showing is it has to do with the quality of the schools, with the input of the parents in terms of school work. We're going to look at parenting styles in a little bit, and you'll see that goes along with social class as well. Who sits down and helps their kids with homework every night in general, that type, who reads to kids, that type of thing. Very different environment according to social class. So, what are the sociological explanations of socialization? Well, there's the social learning theories, uh, which are that people learn new attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors through social interaction, which is, we know that is indeed true. It is a fact. It's one aspect of it. So there's direct and indirect learning. And one of the ways that for both direct and indirect is those rewards and punishments again. The what's called reinforcement. You saw my puppy on the chair here at the beginning of this. He's gone. Well, I'm doing a lot of reinforcement with treats, right? To teach him to come when I call him, to not jump on people, a whole variety of things. That's reinforcement. I'm sure you maybe have done it with animals, and your parents did it with you. All of our parents did to one degree or another, as did the schools and a variety of other things. So it's direct or indirect rewards or punishments. We've talked about this for particular behaviors. They use gender roles as an example, which is, we learn when we're little what little girls are supposed to play with and what little boys are supposed to play with. You can see this very dramatically in the toy aisles in stores, right? Look down the toy aisle for little girls, and you're going to see a lot of pink and a lot of dolls, right? Look down the toy aisle for boys, and you're going to see not much pink. You're going to see a lot of camo, toy plastic, hand grenades, guns, and if for any kind of doll or human figure, it's a G.I. Joe with a very grumpy face. So right there from the get-go. And boy, have you ever seen a young boy wander down the wrong toy aisle? Often a parent will practically dislocate the kid's arm to get him herded down the boy toy aisle, because that's all part of that, reinforcement. That's for girls. This is for boys over here. So that's one example. We learn about gender, for instance, through our families and the roles that the mothers and fathers play. Is it an egalitarian marriage where there's a lot of equality? Maybe they're co-earners and the mom's making a fairly good salary. That makes a big difference in these kinds of reinforcements. What about role models? That's another way we are socialized, by looking at role models, the people we admire and people whose behavior we then imitate. It's often our parents initially when we're little, but also our siblings are very important role models, grandparents, later teachers and friends, that type of thing. And as your book pointed out, even celebrities can be role models for people. So role models can reinforce certain behaviors, but most of our learning is informal. It's not said to us overtly or told to us, you must do this or that. It's what we pick up from the environment. For instance, this study that they bring up in your text, that out of 6,000 picture books for children from 1900 to 2000, females were the central figure in those books for children only about a third of the time. Now, nobody's telling you that males are more important than females in a very explicit manner. Usually, they're not when you're a child, but they could be. But if all your reading material subliminally tells you that because of who you see, it's about representation, right? Representation is very important. It's a big subject right now with racial and ethnic minorities, to have representation. If you don't see yourself ever, then it's very difficult to get that reinforcement that you exist and you're equally important. So what about so the direct and indirect learning that we just talked about is one way that social learning happens. Another is learning and performing. So we learn the roles and the norms through observation. Um, and for instance, we might see friends misbehaving. We have a choice. Well, I like the way that looks. I'm going to misbehave too. Or sometimes we do the opposite. We don't like the way that looks. We don't do it. And believe me, you're going to get positive reinforcement if you do that, right? And then uh, we have choice, in other words, is what this section is saying. As an adult, you may see someone stealing office supplies, and oh man, that's easy to do, but you choose not to. So we do have choices in this learning process, what we learn, right? What we internalize. So, what's the critical evaluation of social learning theories? Well, they help us understand a lot, but they're very focused on early socialization only. And as you'll see, socialization is a lifelong process. It doesn't ever really end. It's most crucial and powerful when we're young, but it's ongoing. So criticism of social learning theories is that, hey, we're only talking about, very early years here, and there's a lot more that happens later. Um, and so it doesn't explain also the reinforcement modeling effect on some children more than others, right? Some children are more impervious to that reinforcement, reward, punishment kind of thing. Even children in the same families, and there's no explanation in this theory of the social learning theories about this. It ignores factors like birth order that we just talked about, which is crucial. Um, for one thing, the first child often gets a lot more input from parents in a lot of ways, and they usually have higher grades. They're more likely to attend college, for instance, the firstborn in a family, that type of thing. So it doesn't look at this theory. And the biggest part for a sociologist that really is a critical evaluation is that it doesn't look at the interconnections with social structures, um, and how social structures affect socialization. So, For instance, more recently, there's been much more divorce and family instability than there was uh, in the past, and things like cohabitation, uh, half siblings, that remarriage, that type of thing. So one outcome of that isn't taken into consideration by these theories is that by age of 9, children who have those experiences, familial disruption, are more likely to demonstrate behavioral problems, delinquency, classroom disruption, fighting, bullying, temper tantrums. I think we're all aware of some of those issues that occur. Not always after divorce or those other issues, remarriage we talked about, but just statistically, children who experience those things are more likely to have some of these negative outcomes. So now let's look at the symbolic interactionist theory. Charles Horton Cooley and the looking glass theory. I put up a short video about that for you to help reinforce this for you. There's 3 steps to it. The first one is the perception. We imagine how we appear to other people. We imagine how they perceive us, right? Oh, they think I'm, whatever, smart, stupid, pretty, ugly, a good athlete, a klutz, whatever, we imagine what they think about us. That's called perception. The second is interpretation of that perception. We imagine how others judge us. Okay. Well, you get a positive judgment if you're smart and pretty, and you probably would think that you would get not such a positive judgment, a more negative judgment. For instance, if you're not a good athlete, you're a klutz and you're a guy. That's really important. Okay. Can be in certain situations. So we're assuming. See, this is all about perception. We're thinking about what we think we know what people think about us, and then the second step is we think we know how they're judging us. That's the interpretation of the perception based on what we think they think of us. And then the third is the response, which is that we have feelings based on how others think about us, and we often develop our perception of ourselves based on what we think others think of us, which can be completely wrong, but it can still affect our self-image. I'm going to give you an example. I always do this in class, and I'm so sorry we're not in class because there's so many examples I could give you. It takes so much time, and in class I feel like there's a lot more time than watching 2 long videos that, whatever. But years ago, I before I was a full-time tenured track instructor at SWAC, which are tenured faculty professor, which I was at SWAC for years. I and part-timers are always kind of on the outsiders anyway in any academic institution. I was walking down the hall, and the woman who was then one of the speech professors, she'd been there for years. She was full-time tenured professor at SWAC. Our classroom, and I knew her outside of the college. We had mutual friends in common, etc. So we knew each other. We saw each other we weren't best buddies or anything, but we saw each other on social occasions. Our classes got out at the same time in the same building. We walked past each other. I said, "Hi, Christine." She looked right past me, completely in my perception, snubbed me, and just walked on, didn't acknowledge me at all. Man, I came home and I told my partner, Peter, I said, this was really nuts. And I was kind of agitated about it, how rude that was and how, disregarding of me that was. You know what I found out later? I found out the next day that she had just been told, it was before cell phones, so it was a knock on her classroom door by someone at SWAC who'd gotten the phone call that her husband was in the hospital. in the emergency room in an extremely dangerous situation. And she was leaving to go straight to Bay Area Hospital. I completely misinterpreted. You see how what this comes down? We do this all the time, and as children, we do it a lot. And when our egos and our sense of self are still very fragile, we often do it. So you might catch yourself about that, making these assumptions about what people think about you, and then develop. You might be right or wrong. That's not such a big deal. What's a big deal is that, as your book said, it still affects our self-image, whether we're right or wrong. Okay, so that's the looking glass theory. George Herbert Mead and the development of the self and role taking goes through developmental stages with children for this. And for Mead, most critical interactions occur within the family, which is the foundation of all socialization. So what he said is that the self develops as we learn to differentiate the I from the me. So there's a distinction of the I and the me. So the I is the creative, imaginative, spontaneous, kind of self-centered, often unpredictable part of us. The me, this is according to Mead, to George Herbert Mead, the me is the part that's socialized and that is aware of other people's attitudes, has self-control. We have internalized appropriate social roles, that type of thing. So, the I would just grab toys from somebody when they were a kid. The me would have understand that it's nice to ask, if you could play with that toy. So from all of that, what we do is we learn what's called role taking. So that's learning to take the perspective of the other. The I only thinks about the self, right? I, right? Only thinks about I. Okay, when you learn role taking, what you do is you learn to take the perspective of the other. So there's 3 stages to that. The first is called the preparatory stage, and that's birth to about 2 years old. An infant does not know itself from others. Have you ever watched an infant play with its feet, up in the air, laying on its back, its feet are up in the air, they might even put them in their mouth. That infant does not know very early on that the feet are part of its own body. They're just things waving around up in the air that they want to grab and play with. That's kind of an example of what he's talking about. The infant doesn't know the self from the other. The I is dominant at this age. They can learn, but up to age, this period lasts till age 2. They learn by imitation. They're not taking the role of the other. They're just imitating what somebody's doing. Daddy shaving, or mommy putting on her makeup, or putting on high heels or something. They don't fully understand the behavior, why daddy's shaving or why mommy's putting on her high heels. Okay. And I'm using very stereotypical and sexist examples. I realize that your book partially is using them, and so I'm using them too. Okay, so they can begin to use behaviors. This is when birth to 2 years old. But they don't associate the words or the symbols in a way that has any cause or effect. So, I'm sorry, excuse me. They do begin to understand cause and effect. They don't understand the meaning of words yet, but they do understand cause and effect. So they get it. This is how we train puppies again. They get it. If they cry, they'll be picked up. Okay, so that's cause and effect, if that's true in their lives. The play stage is 2 to 6 years old, and that is beginning to use language. And the meanings of words are then understood. They begin to have shared cultural meanings. It's cute to watch them learn to do this. There's something called overextension. I don't know if you ever taught words to a young, if you're a parent, you have, to a young child, at the earlier end of this, 2 to 6 years old, and you would teach them the word for ball. Okay. And then what happens is every round thing, they'll very proudly say, ball, ball. So the moon, For instance, they might point to it when it's full, say ball. The same with dog. Every four-legged animal becomes dog. So you're driving along and you see a cow in a pasture, dog. And it's hard and to teach them that there's a distinction that's for a specific creature or object and not the whole thing. So that's this stage of 2 to 6 years old of being able to learn language and use it in culturally and symbolic, its symbol in appropriate ways. So through play at this stage, 2 to 6, they begin to take the role of the other in two different ways. One, they begin to emulate or act out what significant others do. So someone whose opinions we value or we're interested in or we're with a lot, that's usually a parent at this age or a grandparent or a sibling or whatever. Later, it could be a teacher, boyfriend, girlfriend, employer. And the child learns that they have a self that is different from others and that others behave in different ways from them. But they are expected, the child learns that they are expected to behave in specific ways. They are learning norms. Remember, rules is another word for norms. They are learning from 2 to 6 what they can and can't do, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Then the play stage moves beyond that imitation and acting out during this time. And then you can really imagine roles. I'll be the mommy, you be the daddy. I used to teach for Head Start 100 years ago, and it was interesting to watch this stage develop of, beginning to kind of get it that it's not just imitating, it's thinking about a story and what people might do in a particular situation. And this stage is crucial because this is where you begin to learn to take the role of the other. You begin to imagine how others behave and feel, and the me is growing stronger. And to be socialized, you need to have a strong me, not just that I that wants everything that they want without thinking about it. So it's growing stronger because now the child is beginning to be concerned about the judgments of the significant others in their lives. Well, mommy says I'm a good girl when I do da 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 da. She likes me better. Okay. And also, another important part of taking the role of the other is what's called anticipatory socialization. So you're learning how to perform a role that you will occupy in the future. I'm the mommy, you're the daddy. Okay. So generally, or you be the boss and I'll be, you be the teacher, I'll be the student, whatever. You get that? That's in the future. You're beginning to anticipate roles. So that's called anticipatory socialization. And then the game stage is kind of the last stage. And that's 6 years to older. And so that's being able to understand games, right? Connections between roles. And baseball, as your book says, is often used for the metaphor for this. If you're a batter, you've got to know what everybody else is doing, right? Including the pitcher, of course, but mostly the people that are, on the bases, the outfielders that are, you've got to be able to think about all of that. So that's called the game stage. So that's when you begin to think about the generalized other, the norms, values, and expectations of society that affect your behavior. So if you reach this stage, well, you might decide that you want to be an honest person. This is the example the book gives, and I think it's really good. Not because you might get caught if you're not honest, but because honesty is an important social value. So there's a difference between wanting to follow the rules because you might get in trouble and following the rules because you've internalized, for instance, that it's better to operate in the world as an honest person. Okay. So after this generalized other has developed, then it's still iffy that the me never completely overcomes the I. We still will at times act impulsively, as it says, particularly if we're stressed or sick or angry or whatever. We never become perfect, even when we reach the stage of understanding the generalized other, taking the role of the other, right? We've still got that me inside, that creative, impulsive critter. It's been well caged, but it comes out at times. Um, so now we're going to look at dramaturgy. This is one of my favorite ones. It's really great. Irving Goffman. It's called, your book doesn't use the term dramaturgy. Most sociology books do. They talk about staging the self. And what his idea was that social life mirrors the theater. We're all like actors. Um, as Shakespeare said, we're all actors on a stage playing, and we engage in performances, which we do in order to influence or impress or create a certain impression to whoever our audience is, right? And we do that through what's called impression management. We provide information and clues to others to present ourselves. Your book sits in a favorable light. It's in the light you want to be presented in, and most of us want to be presented in a favorable light. But what's favorable to one uh, group and subculture may not be to another, so that can vary. And we want to downplay or conceal uh, our less appealing characteristics. So first you have the setting, okay? Now look around you here. You can tell something about me, I'm sure, from this particular setting that I'm in. I could go to a different part of my house and do these lectures, and it would be a completely different feeling, situation, environment. You can do this with your faculty, if you're in-person faculty, if you go to their offices. When we were always in person, I used to say this, check your faculty's offices out. You can tell the ones who are into art or aesthetics, or who painted an interesting color or put a rug on the floor, and others who just don't care at all. And those, so that's the setting. Okay. Then there's appearance. That's our clothes, our titles, etc., etc., that type of thing. And then our manner is our style, um, and our, some of which we can control, some of which we can't. Language is hugely important in manner. In England, my God, you can place somebody in one of their very complex and convoluted social class categories just by their accent, speaking English, as their first language. So, okay, so that's also the setting, the appearance, the manner. It can be um, vehicles. There are vehicles I wouldn't be caught dead in. I'm sure you all feel the same way, and ones that I like. Uh, but in America, car culture, vehicles are very important about identifying to a great extent who we are and how we feel about all kinds of things. Now, politics, even in terms of, environmental issues and that type of thing. So you get the point. So if you have a hybrid or an all-electric car, that tells people something about you, doesn't it? Okay? And the converse of that as well. Okay, so reference groups. Reference groups are people who shape our self-image. We like them, we look up to them. Okay, they don't have to be good from a societal standpoint. A gang can be a reference group. Generally, that means people that you respect and admire. But once again, that doesn't necessarily mean a teacher or a pastor. It could be a gang person. Okay. Our primary agents of socialization are the individuals or groups or institutions that teach us how to um, participate effectively in society. The family is obviously, I think, the most important uh, agent of socialization. And there are 4 basic parenting styles that we're going to go through here. The first one is authoritarian. You can tell by that word, right? That title, that they are probably very demanding, very controlling, and very punitive. The examples they give you for each one of these is, you can't borrow the car because I said so, or you have to go to bed now because I said so, tired or not, whatever. That's authoritarian. Authoritative is, yes, they're demanding, and there's an element of control, but they're also warm and supportive. So you can borrow the car, but be home by curfew. Just be sure you'll be home by curfew. The third type of parenting is what's called permissive. No demands, okay? Very warm, indulgent, very few rules. Borrow the car whenever you want, honey. Okay? And then the fourth is the uninvolved. They're not supportive or controlling. I don't care what you do, I'm busy. Now, you can think about your own socialization with your parents or your parenting and see where you fall in these four major parenting styles. And I'm sure you've read the chapter, but what do you think is the most successful form of parenting of those four? It's the authoritative, not authoritarian, but authoritative. So with authoritative parenting, the parents are consistently warm, but they're monitoring, they're watching, and there is, and there is discipline, okay? The children, there's been, oh, you can imagine the amount of research that's been done on this subject, a huge amount. So the children of authoritative parents tend to be self-reliant, achievement-oriented, and successful in school. Adolescents with authoritarian, permissive, or uninvolved parents, however, have a harder life path, right? They have poor psychosocial development, they have lower self-reliance, higher levels of delinquent behavior. They're more likely to be influenced by harmful peer pressure and more likely to use drugs or alcohol. Now, the other thing is that, and I mentioned this earlier in this lecture, the findings vary by social class and race and ethnicity, however. So for many Latinos and Asians, the authoritarian parents produce really positive outcomes. The kids don't seem to rebel as much or have as many issues with an authoritarian parenting style across all social classes. Black parents, especially mothers, engage in what's called racial socialization, teaching pride in race, teaching kids how to behave, the talk. I'm sure you're familiar with that terminology, the talk, where you sit your kids down and say, if you are confronted by an authority figure, particularly a policeman, this is what you do. This is how you behave. And, don't get mouthy, don't talk back, keep your hands visible at all times, all those kinds of things. So, and part of that racial socialization is how to deal with authority figures, how to suppress your anger, that type of thing. They often are monitored by their moms in this Black racial socialization training, kind of how to dress, how to be appropriate, that type of thing. Siblings are very, very also important agents of socialization. They can be positive or negative, obviously, depending on what kind of siblings you have, what they're teaching you, or what you're learning from just observing. Grandparents are, many have an enormous influence on children because they're doing things that the parents don't, spending time with kids where the parents don't have time to. Asian families live, many of them, in extended families. They're more likely than any other group to live in extended families in America. And the grandparents are often, not just in Asian families, but in many families, grandparents are often surrogates for parents who are, very busy working. They provide regular care often. 10% of all children in America live with their grandparents. And 33% of those have no parents present at all, the ones who live with grandparents. But what's even most common or more common is grandchildren in the home of grandparents and what's called a multi-generational household, homes where three or more generations live together. All right, I'm going to stop here. I am going to do another lecture. It won't be an hour long, I promise, but it's too important to leave. So